Hello everyone, I'm Jill Foote-Hutton, co-editor of Studio Potter. I'd like to invite you to become a member of Studio Potter today at studiopotter.org, and thank you for listening to another installation of our author chats. In the November issue of Studio Potter, Marion Angelica wrote The Floor of the Sky, wherein she shared ceramics artist Betsy Williams' recent search for high-fire wild clays in New Mexico. I visited with Betsy and Marion to learn a little more about her search, and in our conversation, we get to hear about another project Betsy did in collaboration with Joanna Nakamura of Blue Bear Vending Company. Without further delay, let's get into our visit. Betsy, in the article it says that looking for wild high-fire clay was always in the back of your mind, but I just wanted to scratch at that a little bit and find out why was that always at the back of your mind?
Because in Japan, that's how we worked. We didn't always go out digging for clay, but even the clay that's supplied by the clay supplier is from the area. It was a way of working, and a lot of the techniques that I used to throw with, like, for example, I used almost no water. I never just like dribble water into a pot. That's because I learned from people who are used to using wild clays that don't tolerate that sort of, well, the requirements of how you throw and how you treat it are different.
Well, probably regardless of where you wound up, you would have gone looking for clay because that was the model that you learned from.
Right. So when I came back here, I bought some commercial clay, and you know how it is. You get started with something, and I had to make a living, and next thing you know, years have gone by. I mean, I kicked myself for letting it take so long, but at the same time, the idea of taking off days or weeks at a time to do something like this, I couldn't afford to do it. So
yeah, it is. It's always hard is when you find something that works to pause that, like, especially if you're independently employed, right? You can't stop the revenue stream.
Exactly.
Marion, when you were working on this story with Betsy, were there parts of the conversation that you weren't able to dive into in the article that you wanted to talk about?
Well, yes, indeed. So I'm going to do a pitch right here and now. In addition to looking for wild clay, she has written this book with a poet where her pots, her little plates, and the poems are paired, and it is just lovely. And it's something that she's doing in addition to everything else. So I wanted to be sure that people knew about this because it's really just such a lovely piece.
5 or 6 years ago, I joined Instagram, would post various photos, and sometimes the things I would post would be pictures of the tiny plates. And to be honest, a lot of times that's because that's what I'm working on, and they're very easy to photograph in the in-process stage before I put glaze on them. And so that's what I would post, and I try to put a caption. I'm not one to go on and on in the comment section. But what began to happen is a friend of mine on Instagram, every now and then I'd post like a grouping of 4, which to me would kind of tell the story of what was happening that day, not in an explicit way, but each one would have some connection to what was going on that day for me. And my friend Joanna, every now and then she'd post a haiku in the comments, and she did that often enough that every now and then I would send her my image beforehand so that I could include her poems were better than anything I could come up with to say. So I would give her that opportunity to go ahead and send me her comment so I could post it with my image. She was working on various ways of illustrating the 72 MicroSeasons, which is a way in China or Japan of attending to the changes throughout the year. 72 MicroSeasons, every 5 days, a new season. And so we got the idea that at the beginning of the next cycle, that rather than doing this sort of haphazard thing, we would coordinate and actually have a project where every 5 days she would send her haiku to me and I would illustrate a tiny plate and post that together. And we did that for an entire year, and that became the book. So it didn't start out as, an idea to do a book. It was just something that we did for a year on Instagram.
It starts on February 4th.
Right. Okay.
Spring, but for many of us, it's like ice. And this is the plate, if you can see it.
So with this, we went with the traditional Japanese names and whatever was described in the microseason. But the idea is to pay attention to one's own microseasons, wherever one may be, which takes a few years to kind of get a handle on what's happening at a particular time of year. When do the tarantulas start to migrate, or every place is different. So that's what that was. It was just a natural unfolding of an Instagram post. When I first came to New Mexico with the idea of setting up shop, I called one of the local clay businesses and asked, is there clay? Are there clay deposits here? And the person on the phone said, well, there's nothing worth commercializing. So all of our clay comes from somewhere else.
But you didn't accept that. You went out and found native clay in small places.
And somehow I love that. That's me, right? These little unnoticeable places. That's always where I feel most comfortable. These small things that nobody else is looking for.
I mean, in a way, I just affirm that. I mean, the drawings you do on the tiny plates, they're also intimate and little and looking into the very unique little corners that the rest of us might just overlook.
Yeah, somehow I'd rather do it this way than find a mountain of clay at this point. So.
Well, what else are you finding being in the landscape that obviously I assume informs your drawings? And what are you finding besides clay when you're looking for clay?
The ideal clay searching sort of day is going off to this road that I've found on a map, and I'm not sure, can I really drive up that road? And then you get to these places where, well, the ideal situation is you see some tire tracks, so it's doable, but probably on any given day, you're going to be the only vehicle that's on that road, right? So you can take your time and stop the car in the middle of the road and get out. Anything that you see that looks different, that's my cue to get out of the car and check it out. There's so many places in New Mexico, maybe in the entire country, where a lot of times I'll think, I lived in Manhattan for 5 years, and I'll think, oh, in Manhattan, people are walking, well, not now, but everybody's crammed into this 13-mile stretch of land, and there are places in New Mexico especially that you feel like you're one of the only people who's ever set foot there. And so there's just it's quiet. You can just notice everything that's around you. I can't say it well, but there's a sense of being alive in a specific place that may otherwise go, people aren't stampeding to get there.
In the article, it talks about how you want people to notice these intimate wild places a little more than maybe they do, or recognize what comes from them. It can be difficult to think about the legacy of something like while you're in the middle of it, or we don't really have a lot of control over how history deals with us. But I'm curious what your hopes are for this record that you're building.
Well, at this stage, it's still early. So for me, it just feels like a record of what I found. Maybe this will sound funny to say, but I'm not even doing it with an eye to showing other people. I'm doing it to learn, to discover what's all around me. And that's, you asked me what I find, and one of the interesting things that I've found is you find a lot of stuff that you don't have a word for. Maybe a geologist would have a word for it, I don't know. But I love being in that space where it's the opposite of chit chat, where everybody's got something to say. It's out there with this thing that you don't know what it is, and you're gonna try to figure out some sort of test to do on it to see what it might become. I mean, some things I know the names of them, but there's a primacy about that. So right now it's just me and my notebook, really. I don't plan to lead workshops or take tours or, nothing like that. It's just, I'm totally curious.
Have you learned why the geology of New Mexico is such that there are these, when we teach about clay, often we say, well, the stones are on the mountain and they run down the river and they become clay, blah, blah, blah. But these are pockets, and I don't know, it seems like who knows where they came from. Has the geologist told you anything about why things are the way they are?
Yeah, so some things are pockets, some things are more bands. And I began to notice, you begin to notice patterns. And so I began to notice, for example, a lot of times where I find the best clays in New Mexico, there's not so much, there's vegetation, but things aren't covered in grass or whatever. So for the most part. And so road cuts are just visible exposures of the geology. And I'll notice a sandstone band at the top that's usually like a reddish orange color, and then however many feet below at the road level, that's where the clay is. And so that's all, according to the state geologist, a function of what's been exposed is the weathering of that material at the top over however many tens of thousands of years.
I find it so interesting that it's not rivers of clay that just show up. The bands would make you think that maybe it flowed somewhere. But yeah, just dispersed. It seems dispersed, the high fire clay.
Clearly at this point, I have enough awareness of enough locations that I could get pretty much whatever kind of clay I want to, but that's not the goal anymore, is just going out to get enough clay. I would miss out on what I'm doing if I just decided to stop and go back with a truck. So
Betsy, in the article, it talks about how you have utilized geologists. Are they in return interested in what you are finding and what you're documenting?
I think they're interested in my enthusiasm. But geologists aren't necessarily interested in clay. That's what I've found. Not in clay the way I'm interested in clay. They're interested in geology. And so they know the names of things. They can recognize things better than I can. Clay is what I know. So there's a point of intersection, but it's not, I haven't had any of them want to ride along with me or anything.
Since we talked, and I know it's getting to be wintry again, so you're probably not going to be out hunting, but have you found anything that you've been excited about?
Yeah, so the last time I went out was it's a place not too far from here, and I found, well, I went there because on the geologic map, that Precambrian era, there's a part of the national forest not too far from here, and I thought, well, I'll go poke around there because it looks like it's part of the Precambrian era. I didn't find clay, but what I did find was something I hadn't seen before. So now that I've been doing this for a while, there are certain patterns. You see certain colors and certain types of materials, and you can, at this point, I can kind of guess, oh, well, this is that. I may not have a name for it, but I know what it did in a test and whether or not I want to get more of it. And I found something that was it was sort of a dark green, sort of sticky, probably not clay, And so I got a few samples of that and brought it back to the studio and messed around with it a little bit and ended up trying it as a glaze. And it makes almost a gunmetal black, beautiful, smooth gunmetal glaze. And I think if I were just looking for clay, I would be discouraged many times, because a lot of times I go out and I don't find clay. But I find other things, and I just try to figure out what can I do with it. And if I can't do anything with it, I label it and save it so that when I'm smarter and more experienced, I know what to do with it. So that's the latest discovery. It comes in little fits and starts like that, though. So.
And there was the little caveat that you mentioned, that you had this find that was not a high fire clay, but had sand in it. So what are you going to do with that? Just keep it and know it's there, or is there something special you're considering?
I'm not sure yet. So I try to just keep good notes. That's part of what's exciting, is that I find things, I try to keep good records on what it is, where it came from, how I tested it. And often I hit a barrier and that's where it stops. But unless it's something that's sort of clearly awful, I don't just throw it out in the yard. I'll keep it with the idea that you never know.
What is clearly awful? What would be an example of
I was
something?
trying to think of what's clearly awful. Maybe there is nothing that's clearly awful. But I've found things that, for example, if I try to, they're not clay, if I fire them in the kiln, maybe it melts a little bit, but it doesn't seem to lead me anywhere. That's as awful as it gets. I mean, it's nothing really awful, honestly. So.
If you were going to sum up your motivation for this research, what would you tell someone?
Something about just being witness to that vastness of time. And maybe that's what the allure of all this is just noticing the grandness of what's here to work with. So, I mean, this is one thing I've been thinking about, is that a lot of what determines how you work and what your work is where you focus your time, how you spend time. And so in Japan, I learned to throw very efficiently. I mean, sometimes even it's hard to sort of fathom what that's all about and why, because clearly the point of what I'm doing as a potter isn't to make the most pots. I want to spend more time with the processing of the materials and with the presentation, imagining an environment where you walk into the gallery and each piece will have some bit of information about where it came from. Not specific. I won't give away the GPS location or anything like that, but just an introduction to where this came from, and maybe in some way have an environment. Each piece will have its own environment. What that'll look like exactly, I don't know. That's what I'm imagining right now.
Thanks to Betsy Williams and Marion Angelica for joining me for a Studio Potter author chat. And thanks to all who are listening. If you aren't a member of Studio Potter yet, why not join today so you can read new stories each month from the global community of ceramic artists and have access to our archive of nearly 50 years of the Studio Potter Journal for only $5 a month. I'm Jill Foote-Hutton, co-editor of Studio Potter. Be well, everyone, and thanks for reading.